So I think Harvard was the right place because for really three reasons. I think the first has to be the people, the people that I was able to work with through the Harvard Data Science Institute were incredible, and it gave me the opportunity to bring together a group of people who I don't think necessarily would have worked together. And I think that's the true kind of interdisciplinary mission is to really test an experiment with saying, if you take these different ideas and put them together, will you get more than just the sum of the parts? Will you get more out than what you put in? And I think it was really exciting to experiment with that. And I think the results of that experiment were quite positive. The second reason why Harvard was a really unique and exciting place to do research was also just the other fellows. And I think, using myself as a data point of trying to be interdisciplinary between computer science and psychology and anthropology, then I was able to see these other fellows taking some of the same computational or same mathematical frameworks that I was excited about, that we were able to discuss over dinner or discuss over a variety of different workshops, but then take them into biology or take them into different kinds of physics problems that in astrophysics and other things that these fellows were studying. But we still had sort of a core common language of some of these methodological techniques that we were all able to build on and explore together. And I think that was a really exciting place that really pushed me to think hard about some of the methods that were being developed, not just in my field, but in others as well. And then I think the third is also just the third reason why Harvard was really an incredible place to do a postdoc, especially in particular in the Harvard Data Science Institute, is that the amount of flexibility and freedom. So I don't think there's very rare to have the ability to really act as an independent researcher, where you're able to take on the exact kinds of problems that you want and have the institutional backing and almost mandate to go after that. And I think the data science initiative was extremely effective in setting me up to succeed in terms of both giving me the resources, but also giving me the mandate to say, I'm going to take a risk and let's see if it pays off, and affording me that opportunity. And that was a really important thing. I essentially was wrapping up my PhD at MIT, working with Josh Tenenbaum and a few others back in around 2018. And so around 2017, I started looking around and realizing that I had been collaborating with a few key faculty at Harvard. So in particular, people like Fiery Cushman, Sam Gershman, and at the time, Joe Henrich had just came from a different university to Harvard, who works on a variety of different kinds of social intelligence and social learning. And I had been following the work of David Parks at Harvard, and actually one of the leaders of the Data Science Institute. And so started collaborating with that group of people even close before I finished my PhD, and had been hoping to stay in the Boston, Cambridge area. So and to continue working with those people in particular. And so the Data Science Institute program was was in many ways kind of perfect for what I wanted, which is I wanted to bridge between the kind of computational methods that were being developed in computer science and working with one of the real experts of multi-agent systems, David Parks, but then taking those tools and bringing them to bear on the problems of human intelligence and building AI systems that have human-like reasoning and thinking capabilities. So the program was really nice for me in that it was cross-disciplinary, which is kind of what my PhD was, also between brain and cognitive sciences and artificial intelligence. And then also, so I wanted to continue in that kind of in that lane, and also just really had the key people that I wanted to continue working with. And so that was quite exciting. So I did my PhD on these problems of social intelligence. So trying to understand the kinds of cognitive capabilities that ultimately enable people to develop into the most socially sophisticated form of intelligence that it really exists on Earth. So we have all kinds of different essentially feats that we can do. And I think a lot of them come down to this basic idea that together we can do more than any individual. So the ability to cooperate at large scale. And when you start to look at what enables that large scale cooperation that lets us go from, say, a friendship and a relationship all the way to a country and a company, we can start to kind of break this down and carve these abilities into a few key aspects of intelligence. And so the first is what's sometimes called theory of mind. It's the ability to go from the perception of just say a bunch of pixels on your eye or pixels in a camera to the understanding that the world is actually filled with other humans, and that inside those humans are not just, the stuff that's inside a cube or a block, but rather it's more like the kinds of things that are inside yourself, that the world is filled with creatures that can think and plan and reason, just like the kind of mind that you have yourself. And so that leads to a whole bunch of different downstream capabilities. So you can start to infer what's going on in somebody's head. You never see what's going on, but people act, they communicate, they teach, they do all sorts of sophisticated behaviors. And from those behaviors, we can then go backwards and infer what they're doing. And so one of the key things that I've done in that line of work was to take a Bayesian approach to that problem. So, Bayes is a Bayesian approach is kind of classic approach. But when I say Bayesian approach, what I really mean is thinking about the kinds of sophisticated structure that might be useful for people to make these inferences really fast and really flexibly. So, if you think anything is possible, like if I think inside your head is just a bucket of spaghetti, then I'm going to learn very slowly because there's so many possibilities that I have to account for every time I'm learning. Then I have to cross out each one of those. But if instead I have a very kind of sharp and well-defined prior about how the world might work, so that you're actually a planning agent yourself that has beliefs, desires, intentions, preferences, moralities, I can all of a sudden make very rapid and very sharp inferences about when I see you when I see you or anybody else make a certain sets of behavior. So maybe just to give an example, if I see you share some resources or share some cookies with somebody else, I might think, well, maybe you have a preference for that person. Or I might think, maybe you don't like cookies, and you think they like cookies more. Or maybe you think these are just really simple kinds of inferences that everybody can make and are made by even the youngest children. But if you were to test some of the most sophisticated AI systems on these same kinds of challenges, they might say something much more simple, like, you just like moving your hand in that way. Or you just, or just like, no, that was just like a random motion. So I think, when we look at the kinds of inferences that people and even like, pre-verbal infants are able to make, they involve these kinds of rich mental models of how other agents work. And we use these mental models to make really rapid inferences. And this idea is called theory of mind. The second is how we leverage those ideas like theory of mind to then understand more complicated structures of society and cultural rules. So, one of the most important things that any person learns is how to essentially fit into their culture. And that means learning all of the different, some quite powerful moral rules that guide us in our thinking. And so I've worked on a variety of different projects that look at how, from just a few instances of like the data in this case is behavior that other people are making, behavior that other people are doing relevant to moral rules and values. So I use this example of sharing cookies, but what if I have a choice of sharing cookies with David or with Sam? And now it's a question of what am I learning? What are the relationships that I might have with David or Sam? Is Sam, is one of them my boss? Is one of them my brother? If I choose my brother over my boss, what does that say about my underlying value system? And again, people can make these very rapid inferences. And so we can use the fact that people make those rapid inferences to in some sense, reverse engineer the kinds of underlying moral priors and the mechanisms that people use for moral learning when learning from this kind of data. And the last is, and this is one of the areas that I explored in particularly at Harvard, is social learning. And this is why I wanted to work with Fiery and also with Joe. And Joe has written extensively about this. He's a great book called The Secret of Our Success. And he's, I think, argued quite compellingly that a huge aspect of what makes humans so intelligent, what differentiates us from other kinds of other apes and other kinds of other sophisticated learners and planners, is that we actually learn very rapidly and faithfully from other people. So we're not just trying to figure out how the world works on our own. Instead, we're actually trying to leverage what everybody else in our society knows to kind of bootstrap our knowledge to kind of download, in a sense, this kind of cultural knowledge that everyone has. And so with Fiery, we wrote a paper, and I think it was kind of ambitiously called downloading culture.zip. And the idea was that a lot of the one way we can think about cultural knowledge is as a set of programs. And you could think of all the different programs you might have, all the different data you might have on your computer as being this kind of accumulating database and data store of all the knowledge that a society has accumulated over time. And now you're born into this society, you're faced as the challenge of a learner to figure out how to get access to this knowledge, the pieces that you need, the pieces that are going to be relevant for you. Maybe it's certainly not all relevant for you. There's tons of cultural knowledge our society has that I have no clue at how it works. So how do you figure out what part of cultural knowledge is most relevant for what you or your ultimate goals are, and then how do you actually go about that process, the process of figuring out how to download the right files, the right programs. And we developed some interesting techniques that kind of push on these algorithms called that are sometimes referred to as program learning or program induction. And the idea is, how do you go from raw data that is produced by a program or is evidence of a program, let's say it's the execution trace of a particular program, to then go backwards and say, how can I, to be able to go backwards and say, what was the program that ultimately generated that data? And so we developed some new algorithms and did some interesting experiments looking at how people might actually go about this process, and with the goal of looking at that kind of large scale cultural and social learning. So maybe just to sum up all those different threads, I think, one way I've been framing some of this work now is this idea of multi-agent common sense or cooperative common sense. And I like the term common sense because it points to these capabilities that people have that don't actually feel that smart. And the reason why they don't feel that smart is because we share them so widely across all of us. We're all able to have these abilities, and we use them from the earliest ages. So they don't actually feel that special to us. But when we compare the kinds of things that people can do with what other animals are capable of, or what even our best machine learning and AI systems are capable of, there's this massive gap. It's like they don't even get the problems. And so I think there's these are in some ways, these are like some of the most fundamental ways that we can then now look and say, well, how can we improve these systems, or how can we better understand theoretically and computationally the differences between either a non-human animal and animal, or machine and human. And I think it gives us a much richer scientific picture of what makes humans distinct, and then also how to then use those distinct capabilities to build machines that have those same properties, which is a key thing I'm excited about. So I'll just talk about two other key projects that I think wouldn't have happened without the Harvard Data Science Initiative. So the first was a project we called Finding Friend and Foe in Multi-Agent Games. And this was a really exciting project because it really bridged these ideas of how people learn about others, like how we make inferences about who's good, who's bad, who's a friend, who's a foe, but then also pretty sophisticated AI techniques. And so what we did is we took a deep reinforcement learning approach to playing games. And we took this game called Avalon, which is a hidden role game where you have to guess who's a good collaborator and who's a bad collaborator. And this is a game that's played competitively and for fun by people all around the world. And by combining these two different perspectives, we were actually able to build a superhuman player that was able to collaborate really well with people in this game, and also really well. It was also really powerful as a competitor, so it could both collaborate and compete both with and against people. And so it was kind of taking these two ideas of theory of mind, but then combining it with really sophisticated, scaled up machine learning. The second was another exciting project, again at that intersection of cognitive science and machine intelligence, that we called Too Many Cooks. And we were inspired by a game called Overcooked, where each player controls a little chef and they have to run around a kitchen making recipes. And this is a challenging problem because you have to coordinate all your different behaviors. So, if one person's cooking the fish, then the other person should make the rice. But sometimes, because of the way these kitchens are laid out, both players have to help. So maybe the rice is on one side of the kitchen, but the pot's on the other. So one player has to get the rice, put it on the counter, so the other player can then get it. And so this is a real challenge for almost any machine learning algorithm. If you just put a vanilla deep learning agent into these worlds, they kind of just scramble around, or they converge on one very specific solution. But people are able to play a much wider flexible array of strategies. So they can dynamically shift their strategy. They can figure out when to cooperate with each other and work on the same task. They can divide and conquer, and so figure out, you do this, I'll do that. And they do that with just a few bits of data. So they can do this really rapid one-shot learning. And so what we did is again kind of taking those two perspectives, like looking at how might people solve these tasks, and then taking some exciting literature, exciting work on both combining Bayesian inference with sophisticated kinds of planning, real-time dynamic programming, putting those together and getting an agent that in many ways plays like a person. It has that ability to do one-shot coordination, and that it can, just from a few instances of play, generalize to a new instance. And then second, it has the ability to also explain how people are doing this task. So we had people rate, what should you do, or what are people doing in this task? Our model coarsely corresponded with the kinds of inferences that people made. So it wasn't just, didn't really just hit like kind of human level play, but also was human-like in the way that it played. So that was another, I think, exciting project that I don't think would have happened without that multidisciplinary approach that was possible at Harvard. So I think data science is this really new and exciting way of thinking about a systematic approach to studying problems that are facing humanity in a variety of different contexts. And I think in many ways, this has boomed because each of these fields, whether it's behavioral sciences, physical sciences, engineering, is now being seen as essentially a data generating engine. They, regardless of the context, the amount of data that we have available just broadly as humans has absolutely exploded over the last decade. Many of that is driven by things like the internet, the fact that we can record so much data at scale. And as a result, we have all this data, and then the question is, what do we do with it? And that's been this real need. There's been this real need then for people who have not just a Swiss Army knife of techniques, of specific algorithms, of specific programs that can then crunch the data, produce graphs, and move on, but rather with the domain-specific understanding of how that data is collected, why it's collected, what kinds of insights it might have, and then have this computational toolkit that they can then, in a targeted way, start to ask really specific hypotheses about the kinds of data that we have, the kinds of questions that data might be able to answer. And I see data science as essentially, in some ways, a kind of formalization of the scientific method. You have data, and now you may not be asking, you have so much data that it's giving you, in some sense, a snapshot of the world. And so instead of asking, say, hypotheses directly to the world, you can use the data itself as your hypothesis testing in your hypothesis testing loop. And what that does is it's a massive accelerant to the rate that we can do science and engineering, because when we're doing things in simulation, when we're doing things on large data sets, we can ask so many questions. And so, it's very hard to play 20 questions with nature and win, but we can play, a million questions with data. And oftentimes, even if that doesn't lead to the answer, it can lead to a much smaller set of hypotheses that we then do want to go and test in the real world. And so I think when I look back on some of the work I'd been involved in, even going back to when I was an undergraduate, looking at how the brain worked and different kinds of neural circuits, I was always drawn to this ability always drawn to this problem of, okay, I've spent a lot of time developing an experiment to get some new data that no one else has seen before, but then the fun part starts. Now I can start to think about why or how or what is this data telling me? What does this data mean? How can I create make this data approachable or visualizable to both to me and then to others? And I think it's like, in a way, it's kind of intersected with my own research program, which is the scientific program of taking raw information and then compressing it into very discrete, low-dimensional, understandable theories that are then shareable, that we can then share and talk about and build on. And I think that process of data, I think in some ways that's like a very high level way of taking data science, which can mean almost anything that involves a little bit of math, some computers, and a big data set, and talking about why it's actually this much more fundamental force. It's about taking raw information that's unstructured and turning it into theories that can then be used broadly by people. And so, in my particular domain, that means, in the social behavioral sciences of trying to understand how people think and act, it's about building theories of how the mind works and being able to build theories that aren't just recapitulations of the data that don't just say, well, we measured that people do X over Y, so X is our theory. It's a theory of why people pick X. And the tools of data science allow us to both analyze the data in sophisticated experiments, but also allow us to build theories that go beyond the data. And I think that's ultimately the real goal of data science is to create highly general theories that then can be used for cumulative scientific investigation. And I think the Harvard Data Science Initiative is, really, that's at the heart of it. It's not just about developing a new method or a new tool. It's really about taking the state of the art, going beyond, and then using that to really solve an important question in a particular domain. And I think that's one way that the Harvard Data Science Initiative is quite special, and I think is beginning to show a huge amount of impact. Yeah, so now I'm the CEO and co-founder of a company called Common Sense Machines, which is a few blocks away from where I was working during my postdoc. And it's in many ways, I think intellectually, it's can clearly be seen as an outgrowth of the kinds of questions I was pursuing at Harvard and elsewhere. So, the company's called Common Sense Machines, and it's based on this, trying to understand how people are able to learn so fast and so flexibly. And when we think about what is common sense and what are the kinds of cognitive abilities that people have, one of the key findings of the last decade of research in this area has been that people can learn so quickly because we can build models of the world in our head. So we build mental models of how the world works, and that means we build models all the way from how a rigid object works when I push it, will it slide, to how do other agents work, how might they move, how do they interact, how can I predict the behavior of others. And that's important for problems like trying to build a self-driving car or trying to build a robot that can cook you dinner in your kitchen. But then also even more sophisticated mental models. So models that aren't directly tied to perceptual experience, things like language, or the ability to discuss abstract concepts like, what's a mental model of the stock market? And so what we've realized from almost as like last decade of research is that these mental models in the brain and mind actually may take the form of a kind of 3D simulation. And so then the question is that the question for how people build these mental models then becomes, how does the human brain and mind translate the perceptual world that we experience into these kinds of simulations? And so our company is essentially working on trying to build AI systems that can do that same problem, that can translate the world in simulations and then use those simulations to solve a whole variety of tasks that require flexible intelligence. So whether it's perceiving objects, being able to reason about the physical properties of different environments, being able to come up with novel plans that are responsive to the behavior of other agents. All of these are key capabilities, and the way people solve them is by building mental models. And I think one of the reasons why we've seen previous approaches are significantly more brittle is because they don't have the kind of flexibility and robustness that people do. So we're trying to create systems that are able to learn to build these models so that they essentially will have this human-like ability to generalize to a wide variety of situations, while having some of the key benefits that machines have. They're fast, reliable, and cannot be incredibly precise when correct. Yeah, I think it's fun to think 50 years out, because hopefully by then we'll be using different media for communication. So this interview will be long lost, and no one will hold me to it. But I think 50 years is an exciting time horizon, right? Because if you extrapolate some of the trends of, say, the last few decades, you can get to a pretty incredible place. That's the power of compounding and the power of exponentials in technology broadly. And I think that's a reasonable time horizon. And I think we'll have, even before, have various kinds of artificial general intelligence, and that is the kinds of intelligence that in many ways is human-like. And then just because of the way that machine intelligence differs from human biology, I think we'll have really quite broad ways in which machine intelligence can go far beyond what people are capable of. I think that raises a whole very fascinating slew of ethical questions of what will be the role of people in society. And I'm not an expert on any of the kind of economic factors, although it's obviously very interesting. I think, one thing that's clear is that humans are incredibly general in what we can do, and so we may find other interesting things that we're capable of doing that are still too hard for machines. I think one area where we haven't seen that kind of exponential is just in terms of hardware. So there's nothing even close that has this kind of capability in terms of sensing and action. Our hands are really amazing. So maybe I'm not sure what that says, but I think there'll still be aspects of embodiment that will be quite challenging for non-biological agents, or agents that are made of non-biological materials, to make it as broad as possible. But at the same time, I think the ethical questions that I'm most drawn to and have thought most about are questions of value, of what will be valued in such a society where so much of the work and economic activity is being done by let's say by autonomous systems. And I think then you can ask the question of how will that shape then the moral values of our society. And I think it's quite interesting to think then whether those kinds of machine intelligences will diminish our moral sensibilities, because they'll remove many of the constraints that morality is meant to help us navigate and solve. Like, if we're living in a society that's post-scarcity, how does that change the fact that so much of our morality is thinking about resource allocation under scarce resources, or generosity, meaning that some person doesn't have enough while others have more? If you think about a true kind of golden age of artificial general intelligence, maybe those issues are no longer as important. At the same time, I think one of the most interesting parts of that is going from where we are today to maybe these kind of more AI-driven societies, is how is that in order for these systems to even be successful by our own measure, they have to be aligned to our values, right? So, and what I mean by alignment is we wouldn't want to deploy a sophisticated AI system that doesn't value human life or doesn't value some of the same values that we do. And then the question becomes, well, whose values? How should we integrate the fact that not every person, barely any person can agree about the same kinds of answers to important moral questions? And so how do we build systems that can integrate across those different belief systems? But I think from my perspective, one of the exciting research questions then is, how do we just, even before you even can integrate, you first have to learn. And the one way you could learn is maybe it's just reading a bunch of books by philosophers, but I don't actually think that's where most of the moral knowledge is. I think most of the moral knowledge is trapped in our minds, and it's expressed only through our behavior, our actions. It's when we act morally, not just when we talk about what it means to be moral. I think that's where the richest moral theories actually are. And so how could we first, leverage sophisticated kinds of machine learning to learn these kinds of moral theories with the richness that they truly contain? But then second, I think there's also the opportunity to, as a kind of reflective mirror to society, right? If you have a machine that is capable of learning these moral principles, maybe that's actually can help make them more understandable or interpretable to us. And so you get this kind of new world where we're not just saying, well, we want the machine to copy us, but rather working together as a collaborator with some of these more sophisticated AI systems that can actually lead us to, by being able to reflect our moral theories back to us, help us understand, refine, and maybe even in some truly moral sense, progress our values to a greater sense. So maybe just one concrete example on this topic that we mentioned in one of our papers about common sense morality, which is, there's a technique in data science machine learning called active learning, and in active learning or interactive learning. And in this context, basically, you have the machine learning system isn't just given a bunch of true false labels and then tries to fit a function that can predict true false on a bunch of different new data, but instead the system can actually ask for specific data points. It can say, what would you say here? And by being able to ask for the answers to certain data points, it can think about, well, where am I most uncertain? And then if I ask for right near that point, I can get a better sense of the function. Because if I don't know where it looks like here, I can say, well, I'm uncertain here. Tell me what the answer is here. That's where it's really useful for me to know. And I think it'd be really interesting to think about, a moral learning system that can learn about our moral values, but then also kind of ask us these questions that kind of exploit the fact that we may not have thought about certain parameter spaces in those moral theories. So, and I think this is something that actually philosophers do all the time, right? So if you think about some of these like moral dilemmas, essentially they're probes to help us realize that actually, there's a space here that we haven't really thought about. And by thinking about it, that can then yield a richer understanding of those theories themselves. Philosophers sometimes call this a reflective equilibrium, where you're going between the theory that you have and the data, the intuitions that you have that theory predicts, and then you go back and forth. Sometimes you change your intuitions, sometimes you change your theory, and I think it'd be really exciting to bring a machine intelligence into that reflective equilibrium.